The crystalline spires of New Terra gleamed under the triple suns, their surfaces reflecting the morning light in prismatic rainbows that danced across the marble courtyards of the royal palace. Commander Zakthal of the Hegemony Royal Guard stood at attention, his forearms positioned precisely according to military protocol, each hand gripping a ceremonial weapon that could level a city block if needed. His carapace, polished to mirror brightness, bore the scars of 100 battles across a dozen worlds where humanity had proven their worth to the galactic hegemony. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a Kethraki warrior who had once viewed humans as soft, primitive creatures barely worthy of notice, now served as the personal protector of their most precious child. Princess Charlotte Windsorchin, heir to the human throne and symbol of humanity's place in the galactic community, was celebrating her 7th birthday today. The palace bustled with preparations as delegates from 47 different species had arrived to pay their respects to the young princess who represented humanity's future among the stars. Zakthal had been her constant shadow for 3 years now, ever since the assassination attempt that had nearly claimed her life during a diplomatic function on Centauri Prime. He remembered that day with crystal clarity. The plasma bolt had been meant for her heart, but Zakthal's reflexes, honed through decades of combat, had moved faster than conscious thought. His lower left arm still bore the burn scar where the energy weapon had grazed him as he threw himself between the assassin and the 4-year-old princess. The sight of her small, terrified face looking up at him from behind his protective bulk had changed something fundamental in his warrior's heart. Now, 3 years later, he watched her with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, yet found wonder in her simple human gestures. She moved through the morning preparations with the natural grace of someone born to leadership, but, underneath the royal protocols, she remained essentially what she had always been, a curious, kind-hearted child who saw the galaxy not as a collection of potential threats, but as an endless source of friends waiting to be made. "Commander Zakthal," came the melodious voice of Princess Charlotte as she approached his position near the grand staircase. Her formal court dress, woven from shimmer silk and embedded with microlights that responded to her emotions, currently glowed with the warm golden hues of happiness and excitement. "Are all the guests really coming today?" Zakthal's primary eyes focused on her while his secondary eyes maintained their scan of the surrounding area. His species' natural paranoia had been amplified by years of military service, but, around Charlotte, he found himself constantly fighting the urge to relax his guard. Her presence had a calming effect that defied all his training. "Yes, Your Highness," he replied in his careful, precisely modulated English. Despite having 6 vocal cords that could produce sounds across frequencies impossible for human ears, he had spent months learning to speak in tones that wouldn't frighten her. Representatives from the crystalline communes of Sigma Draconis, the hive minds of the outer spiral, even the reclusive thought weavers of the Andromeda Gateway have sent emissaries. Charlotte's eyes widened with genuine delight. At 7, she possessed an intuitive understanding of interspecies politics that amazed even the most experienced diplomats. She knew that the presence of the thought weavers, who rarely left their home dimension, represented a significant honor for humanity. "Do you think they'll like the party?" she asked, unconsciously reaching out to touch his armored forearm with her small hand. The gesture was natural, unthinking, the kind of casual contact that humans shared without thought but which sent electric shocks through Zakthal's nervous system every time it happened. In Kethraki culture, physical contact was reserved for combat, mating, or death rites. The concept of casual, affectionate touch was as foreign to his species as breathing underwater would be to humans. Yet somehow, this small human child had turned his understanding of social interaction on its head with her innocent gestures. "I believe they will find much to appreciate in human hospitality, Princess," he answered, his voice carrying undertones of warmth that would have surprised his former battle brothers. "Your mother has planned entertainment that showcases the best of human culture while respecting the sensitivities of our guests." Queen Isabella Windsorchin appeared at the top of the staircase, her presence commanding instant attention from everyone in the hall. She had been born in the early days of human expansion into the galaxy, when contact with alien species was still new and terrifying. Her generation had learned to navigate the complex web of galactic politics through trial and error, often paying for their mistakes in blood. That experience had forged her into one of the most respected leaders in the hegemony, human or otherwise. "Charlotte, darling," she called in the voice that had negotiated peace treaties and declared war with equal authority, "it's time for the morning briefings." We need to review the gift-giving protocols for each species. Charlotte sighed, the sound carrying the weight of someone much older than 7. Do I really need to memorize all 47 different greeting rituals, Mother? Commander Zachthal says that sincerity matters more than perfect protocol. Queen Isabella's gaze shifted to Zachthal, one eyebrow raised in an expression that conveyed both amusement and mild reproach. Commander Zachthal is wise, but today you represent not just yourself, but all of humanity. These beings have traveled across the galaxy to honor you. The least we can do is show them the respect of following their customs. Zachthal felt the familiar tightness in his thorax that accompanied any reminder of the impossible burden placed on this child's shoulders. She was 7 years old, an age when Kethraki younglings were still learning to coordinate their limbs, yet human society expected her to serve as a diplomatic bridge between species whose evolutionary paths had diverged millions of years ago. I'll help you practice during the preparation time, he offered quietly. We can review the mantid clicking patterns and the gaseous collective's harmonic sequences. Charlotte beamed up at him, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that had become increasingly rare as her royal duties expanded. Really? You'd do that? It would be my honor, Princess. As they began ascending the staircase toward the royal chambers, Zachthal reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since accepting this assignment. He had expected to serve as a glorified bodyguard, a living weapon station near humanity's most important child. Instead, he had found himself becoming something he had never intended to be, a friend, a mentor, and, perhaps most surprisingly, someone who cared about Charlotte's happiness as much as her safety. The morning briefings passed in a blur of diplomatic protocols and cultural sensitivity reminders. Charlotte absorbed the information with the focused intensity that had impressed her tutors since she was old enough to speak. She practiced the complex dance greeting of the spheroid collective until her movements flowed like liquid mercury, mastered the precise pitch variations required to properly address the silicon-based architects, and even managed a credible approximation of the temporal displacement gestures used by the Time Walker delegation. Through it all, Zachthal stood silent vigil, his forearms positioned to respond to any threat while his mind catalogued every entrance, exit, and potential weapon in the vicinity. But, increasingly, he found himself watching Charlotte not for signs of danger, but simply because her determination and grace filled him with something his species had no word for: pride in another being's accomplishments. The first guests began arriving as the primary sun reached its zenith. The crystalline communes materialized in pillars of structured light, their forms shifting through geometric patterns that hurt human eyes to observe directly. The hive minds emerged from biomechanical transports that pulsed with organic rhythms, their collective consciousness focused through thousands of individual drone bodies. Most magnificent of all, the Thoughtweavers stepped through dimensional portals that left reality slightly blurred around the edges, their presence bending spacetime in ways that made Zachthal's battle-hardened nerves twitch with unease. Charlotte greeted each delegation with perfect protocol, her small form somehow managing to project authority and welcome simultaneously. Zachthal watched with growing admiration as she navigated conversations with beings whose thought processes were fundamentally alien to human cognition. She discussed quantum probability matrices with the gaseous collective as easily as she chatted about flower arrangements with the plant-based Verdant Federation. But it was during the gift presentation ceremony that something shifted in the atmosphere of the gathering. Ambassador Krexith of the Void Stalkers, a species known for their ruthless efficiency and emotional coldness, approached the princess with obvious reluctance. The Void Stalkers had only recently joined the hegemony after centuries of warfare, and their presence at the ceremony represented a diplomatic coup for humanity. They were beings of living shadow and crystallized hatred, sustained by consuming the fear and despair of other species. Krexith extended one of its writhing appendages, offering a gift wrapped in what appeared to be solidified darkness. The Void Stalkers present this token of acknowledgement to the human offspring, it said in a voice like grinding glaciers. Charlotte accepted the gift with perfect composure, but Zachthal noticed the slight tremor in her hands as the shadow wrapping began to dissolve at her touch. What emerged was a shard of pure obsidian that seemed to absorb light from its surroundings, creating a zone of absolute darkness around itself. A fragment of our home void, Krexith explained, its tone carrying undertones that made several nearby delegates step back involuntarily. It contains the distilled essence of despair from 1,000 conquered worlds. Your species finds such darkness educational. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. The Voidstalkers were suggesting that humanity's rapid rise in the galactic community was built on the suffering of others, that their success came at the cost of moral compromise. It was a diplomatic provocation designed to embarrass the human royal family in front of the assembled delegates. Zakthal felt his battle instincts surge to the surface. His hands tightened on his weapons as he calculated the most efficient way to eliminate the Voidstalker ambassador before it could threaten Charlotte. The princess was strong for her age, but she was still just 7 years old. Being exposed to concentrated despair could damage her developing psyche in ways that might never heal. But, before he could act, something extraordinary happened. Charlotte looked down at the obsidian shard with curious eyes, seemingly unaffected by the waves of psychic darkness radiating from its surface. Then, slowly, deliberately, she clasped the artifact to her chest and closed her eyes. The assembled delegates watched in stunned silence as the zone of darkness around the shard began to flicker. The absolute blackness that had seemed impenetrable started to develop tiny pinpricks of light, like stars being born in the depths of space. "I can feel them," Charlotte said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "All the people who suffered to make this. They're so sad, so scared. But they're not alone anymore." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Ambassador Krexith. "Thank you for trusting me with their pain. I promise I'll take good care of it." The obsidian shard in her hands had transformed. Where once there had been only consuming darkness, now there was something that looked like a window into a star-filled night sky. The despair contained within had been somehow transmuted into something that resembled hope without destroying its essential nature. Krexit staggered backward, its writhing appendages trembling with what Zakthal recognized as shock. "Impossible," it whispered. "The void cannot be illuminated. Despair cannot become hope. It is against the fundamental laws of existence." Charlotte stepped forward, still holding the transformed artifact. "Maybe," she said with the simple wisdom that only children possessed, "but sadness can be shared. And, when sadness is shared, sometimes it becomes something else." She extended the shard toward Krexith. "Would you like to hold it again? It still remembers where it came from, but now it remembers other things too." The Voidstalker ambassador reached out with trembling appendages and accepted the transformed gift. The moment it touched Krexith's shadowy form, the ambassador let out a sound that no Voidstalker had made in recorded history, a sob. "What have you done?" Krexith demanded, but its voice carried wonder instead of anger. "What is this feeling?" "I think it's called compassion," Charlotte replied. "It's when you feel sad for someone else's sadness, but also want to help make it better." Zakthal watched this exchange with growing amazement. In his decades of military service, he had seen the Voidstalkers consume entire civilizations without showing the slightest emotional response. They were beings of pure predatory instinct, evolved to feed on suffering. Yet somehow, a 7-year-old human child had managed to introduce them to empathy. The implications were staggering. If humanity could affect even the Voidstalkers, what other supposedly impossible transformations might they accomplish? What other fundamental laws of existence might bend before the strange alchemy of human compassion? As the ceremony continued, Zakthal found himself viewing the assembled delegates through new eyes. These beings had come to honor a human child, but they were leaving with something far more valuable, a glimpse of what humanity truly offered to the galaxy. Not military might or technological superiority, but the ability to transform suffering into strength, to find light in absolute darkness, to extend compassion to those who had never known it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of festivities and diplomatic exchanges, but Zakthal's attention remained fixed on Charlotte. He watched her dance with the spheroid collective, their geometric forms somehow managing to approximate human movement. He observed her patient explanation of human humor to the literal-minded silicon architects. Most remarkably, he witnessed her genuine laughter as the Time Walker delegation showed her glimpses of possible futures where humanity and alien species worked together to build wonders beyond current imagination. As the triple suns began to set, painting the crystalline spires in shades of amber and rose, the formal ceremonies concluded and the guests began to depart. But many lingered, reluctant to leave the presence of this remarkable human child who had somehow managed to touch the essence of what made her species special. Zachthal maintained his vigilant watch as the last of the delegates said their farewells, but his mind was processing implications that went far beyond simple security concerns. Today had proven something that the galactic hegemony's most brilliant political theorists had been debating for decades, that humanity's value to the galactic community extended far beyond their military capabilities or technological innovations. They possessed something that no other species had demonstrated to this degree, the ability to genuinely understand and empathize with radically different forms of consciousness, to find common ground with beings whose evolutionary paths had produced entirely alien ways of thinking and feeling. As the palace settled into evening quiet, Zachthal found himself walking alongside Princess Charlotte toward her private chambers. The day's formal protocols had been set aside, and she had changed from her ceremonial dress into the simple cotton nightgown that was her preferred sleepwear. Her feet were bare, and she moved with the easy, unconscious grace of a tired child looking forward to rest. "Commander Zachthal," she said as they climbed the stairs toward her quarters, "do you think Ambassador Krexith will be okay?" It seemed very confused when it left. Zachthal considered his response carefully. "I believe the ambassador experienced something new today, Princess. Change can be frightening, even when it leads to something better." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "Like when I first met you? I was scared because you looked so different from humans, but then I realized you were just Zachthal, and Zachthal is my friend." The simple statement hit Zachthal with unexpected force. He had served the hegemony for over 40 years, had earned medals and commendations from a dozen different species, had been acknowledged as one of the finest warriors of his generation. But, somehow, being called friend by this small human child felt like the greatest honor he had ever received. They reached Charlotte's chambers, where her human attendants waited to complete the evening routine. Zachthal took his customary position outside her door, where he would maintain his vigil throughout the night. It was a duty he had performed thousands of times, but tonight felt different somehow. As Charlotte disappeared into her private quarters, Zachthal found himself thinking about the moment when she had transformed the Voidstalker's gift. The technical implications were mind-boggling. Somehow, a 7-year-old child had managed to alter the fundamental quantum structure of an artifact created by one of the galaxy's most powerful species. But the philosophical implications were even more profound. If humans could routinely accomplish feats that other species considered impossible simply by approaching them with empathy and compassion, what did that say about the nature of reality itself? Was the universe more responsive to emotional and spiritual forces than the hegemony scientists had ever imagined? Zachthal's meditation was interrupted by a soft sound from within Charlotte's chambers. It was a sound he had heard many times before but had never fully understood, the sound of a human child crying quietly in the darkness. His warrior instincts immediately went on high alert. Was she in pain? Had the day's exertions proven too much for her young body? Had some delayed effect from contact with the Voidstalker artifact begun to manifest? Moving with the silent precision that had made him legendary among the hegemony's special forces, Zachthal activated the room's internal sensors. What he saw made his primary heart skip a beat. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, her small frame silhouetted against the starlight streaming through the crystalline windows. In her hands, she held the transformed obsidian shard from the Voidstalkers, and tears traced silver paths down her cheeks as she stared into its star-filled depths. The artifact pulsed with gentle light, responding to her emotional state with waves of luminescence that painted the room in shifting patterns of hope and sorrow. Zachthal's tactical assessment systems immediately began analyzing potential threats, but his deeper consciousness recognized something far more complex than simple distress. The child wasn't crying from fear or pain, she was crying from the overwhelming weight of empathy that had allowed her to transform the artifact in the first place. Protocol dictated that he should alert the Queen immediately, summon the royal physicians, and initiate full protective measures. Instead, Zachthal found himself doing something that violated every principle of his military training. He gently knocked on the chamber door. "Princess Charlotte," he said softly, his voice carefully modulated to carry comfort rather than alarm. "Are you well?" There was a moment of silence, then, the sound of bare feet padding across marble floors. The door opened to reveal Charlotte's tear-streaked face, her small hand still clutching the transformed artifact. In the artifact's glow, her expression held a wisdom far beyond her 7 years, the look of someone who had touched something fundamental about the nature of existence and been forever changed by the experience. "I can hear them, Zachthal," she whispered, her voice carrying the trembling quality of someone barely containing enormous emotional pressure. "All the people who suffered to make this thing. Their voices are so quiet, but they're still there, trapped inside the darkness. They've been alone for so long." Zachthal felt his battle-hardened heart constrict with something that might have been pain. His species processed trauma differently than humans. HFY warriors either died in battle or learned to compartmentalize suffering into manageable segments that could be analyzed and filed away. But humans, he was beginning to understand, experienced empathy as a form of shared consciousness that could overwhelm their individual sense of self. "May I enter, princess?" he asked formally, though every fiber of his being urged him to rush to her side. Royal protocol was sacred, but watching this child suffer alone was becoming unbearable. Charlotte nodded and stepped aside, allowing his massive form to enter the chamber. The room was designed for human comfort, with furniture and decorations scaled for beings much smaller than himself, but Zachthal had learned to navigate the space without disturbing anything. He settled into a position that humans called kneeling, bringing his head down to Charlotte's eye level while maintaining the respectful distance that protocol required. "Tell me about the voices," he said gently, using the same tone he might employ when debriefing a traumatized soldier after battle. Charlotte clutched the artifact tighter, and its internal light pulsed brighter in response. "There are so many of them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mothers calling for children who will never come home. Warriors who died protecting people they loved. Artists whose songs were silenced before they could finish their masterpieces. They're all trapped in this little piece of darkness, and they've been trapped for hundreds of years." She looked up at Zachthal with eyes that held depths no 7-year-old should possess. "How do I help them? How do I set them free without destroying what they are? They don't want to be erased, they want to be remembered, to matter, to know that their suffering meant something." Zachthal found himself facing a question that his military training had never prepared him to address. How did one counsel a child who had accidentally tapped into the collected trauma of an entire civilization? How did one explain to someone so young that some burdens were too heavy for any single being to carry? "In my culture," he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a diplomat negotiating a peace treaty, "we believe that suffering shared becomes strength. Not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into something that can help others avoid the same fate." Charlotte wiped her nose with the back of her free hand, a gesture so fundamentally human and childlike that it sent waves of protective instinct through Zachthal's nervous system. "But they're not from your culture. They're not even from species that exist anymore. The Void Stalkers consumed their entire civilization centuries ago. How do I share their suffering when there's no one left who would understand what they went through?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Zachthal realized that Charlotte had stumbled onto one of the great philosophical dilemmas that plagued advanced civilizations: the responsibility of survivors to honor the memory of the vanished, the duty of the living to give meaning to the deaths of the forgotten. "Perhaps," he said after a long moment of consideration, "the understanding doesn't have to come from their own species. Perhaps the very fact that you can hear their voices, that you can feel their pain across the barriers of time and biology, means that their suffering has found a purpose they never could have imagined." Charlotte looked down at the artifact, and Zachthal watched in fascination as the star-filled darkness within seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Do you really think so? Do you think they can hear me when I listen to them?" "I think," Zachthal said carefully, "that consciousness is far more complex than any of our sciences have yet discovered. If you can touch their memories through that artifact, perhaps communication flows in both directions." Charlotte closed her eyes and pressed the transformed shard against her forehead. For a moment, the room filled with a sound like distant singing, not audible exactly, but felt in the bones and the blood, a harmony of voices that spoke in frequencies beyond normal hearing. Zachthal's enhanced senses picked up patterns in the sound that reminded him of his own species' death songs, the ritual chants that HFY warriors sang to honor fallen comrades. "They say thank you," Charlotte whispered, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "They say they've been trying to sing for so long, but no one could hear them until today. They're not angry anymore. They're just tired." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Zachthal.
They want to rest now. But they don't know how. Zachthal felt something shift in his understanding of the universe.
If these consciousness fragments had indeed been trapped within the obsidian shard for centuries, if they had maintained their individual awareness throughout their imprisonment, then, what Charlotte had accomplished went beyond simple empathy. She had provided a form of psychic hospice care for beings whose suffering had been extended far beyond natural death. In my military experience, he said slowly, the greatest gift we can give to the dying is permission to let go. Perhaps these voices need someone to tell them that their vigil is over, that their pain has been witnessed and acknowledged, that they are free to find whatever peace lies beyond consciousness.
Charlotte nodded solemnly. Will you help me? I don't know the right words for something this important. The request struck Zachthal like a physical blow.
She was asking him to participate in something that was part funeral rite, part exorcism, part act of cosmic mercy. His military training told him to maintain professional distance, to contact specialists who could handle such situations properly. But, looking at Charlotte's earnest face, seeing the weight of responsibility she had taken upon herself, he found that professional distance was impossible. It would be my honor, Princess, he said formally, though his voice carried undertones of emotion that surprised them both. They spent the next hour in quiet conversation with the voices only Charlotte could fully hear. Zachthal provided the structure of Kethriki death rituals while Charlotte served as translator and mediator, helping centuries-old consciousness fragments find the courage to release their grip on existence. The transformed artifact grew brighter with each spirit that chose to let go, until the star field within its depths became a galaxy of lights, each one representing a being who had found peace at last. When the final voice faded into silence, Charlotte collapsed against Zachthal's armored chest, exhausted by the emotional labor she had undertaken. The obsidian shard in her hands had become something else entirely, a crystal that seemed to contain actual starlight, beautiful and warm and free of the crushing despair that had once defined it. They're free now, she murmured against his carapace, her words muffled by fatigue and relief. They said to tell you that Kethriki death songs are beautiful, even when sung for people who never knew your species existed. Zachthal felt moisture gathering in his primary eyes, an autonomic response that his species rarely experienced outside of mating cycles or extreme physical trauma. The idea that his ritual contributions had been meaningful to beings from civilizations lost before his own had achieved spaceflight was overwhelming in ways he couldn't fully process. Princess, he said softly, what you accomplished tonight will be remembered long after both our species have returned to stardust. You have given peace to beings who had no hope of finding it through any other means. Charlotte pulled back to look at him, and, in her tired eyes he saw not the 7-year-old child who had giggled at alien jokes that afternoon, but something approaching the monarch she would one day become, someone capable of bearing impossible burdens with grace, of finding solutions to problems that had never been solved because no one had possessed the courage to try. Is this what being human means? She asked. Taking on pain that isn't yours because someone has to carry it? The question cut through Zachthal's philosophical defenses like a plasma blade through tissue paper. He had served alongside human soldiers for years, had watched them throw themselves into hopeless battles to protect beings they had never met, had seen them weep for enemies who had tried to kill them minutes before. He had attributed these behaviors to tactical training or cultural programming, but Charlotte's innocent question forced him to confront a more fundamental truth. I believe, he said carefully, that being human means recognizing that all conscious beings are connected in ways that transcend species, biology, and even time itself. What you did tonight, hearing voices that no one else could hear, caring about suffering that happened before you were born, that represents the best of what humanity offers to the galaxy. Charlotte yawned, the enormous emotional expenditure of the evening finally catching up with her small body. Will you stay until I fall asleep? I don't want to be alone right now. Of course, Princess. I will remain until you no longer need me. Zachthal helped Charlotte settle into her bed, carefully positioning the transformed artifact on her nightstand where its gentle light could provide comfort without overwhelming her senses. He then resumed his protective position near the door, but kept his primary eyes focused on the small figure beneath the covers. As Charlotte's breathing deepened into sleep, Zachthal found himself replaying the events of the day with new understanding. He had watched a 7-year-old human child accomplish something that the combined scientific resources of the galactic hegemony would have declared impossible, not through advanced technology or superior firepower, but through the simple application of empathy and compassion to a problem everyone else had assumed was unsolvable.
The implications were staggering.
If humans could routinely achieve the impossible through emotional rather than intellectual approaches, if they could transform suffering into healing through acts of willing vulnerability, then the future of galactic civilization might depend not on advancing technology or military might, but on learning to see the universe through human eyes. A soft chime from his communication implants indicated an incoming priority message from Queen Isabella. The quantum encrypted text appeared directly in his visual cortex. Commander Zakthal, security sensors detected unusual energy signatures from Charlotte's quarters.
Status report required immediately.
Zakthal composed his response with careful attention to both accuracy and diplomacy. Princess Charlotte experienced brief exposure to psychoactive elements within Void Stalker gift artifact.
Situation resolved through application of human empathic capabilities. Princess is now sleeping peacefully. No medical intervention required. Full briefing available upon request. The reply came back almost instantly. Empathic capabilities? Commander, that artifact contained concentrated psychic trauma from dozens of extinct civilizations. Exposure should have required immediate psychiatric intervention. How exactly did a 7-year-old child resolve something that our best xenopsychologists would consider a level 7 cognitive hazard?
Zakthal found himself struggling to compress the evening's revelations into language that wouldn't sound like the delusions of a combat-traumatized soldier. How did one explain that humanity's greatest strength might be their willingness to embrace suffering they couldn't fix, to listen to voices others couldn't hear, to offer comfort to beings who had no logical reason to trust them? Your Majesty, he typed carefully, I believe Princess Charlotte demonstrated capabilities that may represent a new frontier in consciousness studies. The artifact has been rendered safe through her intervention. I recommend consultation with xenopsychology specialists, but not as emergency responders, as researchers studying a breakthrough in interspecies empathic connection. There was a longer pause before Queen Isabella's next message. Commander, are you saying that my 7-year-old daughter just made a major scientific discovery while playing with an alien gift? I am saying, Zakthal replied, that Princess Charlotte may have demonstrated that consciousness operates according to principles we do not yet understand, and that humanity's intuitive grasp of these principles could revolutionize our approach to galactic diplomacy and conflict resolution. The pause stretched long enough that Zakthal began to worry that he had overstepped the boundaries of his position. He was a military officer, not a scientist or philosopher, and his observations might sound like the fantasies of someone too close to his assignment to maintain objective perspective. Finally, Queen Isabella's response appeared. Schedule a full debriefing for tomorrow morning.
Include detailed sensor data and your personal observations.
If Charlotte has indeed accomplished something unprecedented, the Hegemony Council needs to understand the implications immediately.
Zakthal acknowledged the order and returned his attention to his sleeping charge.
Charlotte had shifted in her sleep, one small hand reaching toward the transformed artifact on her nightstand. Even unconscious, she seemed drawn to the light that had been born from darkness through her intervention. As the night deepened and the palace settled into quiet, Zakthal found himself contemplating questions that had never occurred to him during his years of military service.
If a human child could transform the concentrated despair of extinct civilizations into something beautiful, what other seemingly impossible transformations might humanity accomplish? What other fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence might prove incorrect when viewed through the lens of human empathy?
The universe suddenly seemed far larger and more mysterious than it had that morning, full of possibilities that no tactical manual had ever considered. And, at the center of these vast new possibilities slept a 7-year-old girl who had changed the galaxy simply by caring about beings she had never met, suffering she had never experienced, and pain that everyone else had assumed was permanent. Zakthal settled into the meditative state that Kethraki warriors used to maintain alertness during long watches, but his consciousness remained focused on a single, transformative realization. He was not just guarding the future queen of humanity, he was protecting someone whose very existence might represent a new stage in the evolution of consciousness itself. The transformed artifact pulsed gently on Charlotte's nightstand, its starlight casting patterns on the ceiling that seemed to tell stories of hope emerging from darkness, of love conquering despair, of small hands reaching across the void to offer comfort to beings who had thought themselves beyond all help. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new diplomatic complexities, new threats to assess and counter. But tonight, in the quiet of a child's bedroom on a world circling alien suns, Zakthal stood watch over something more precious than he had ever imagined possible, proof that the universe was stranger, kinder, and more responsive to love than anyone had dared believe. Dawn came early to New Terra, the triple suns rising in sequence to paint the sky in layers of gold, crimson, and violet. Zakthal had maintained his vigil throughout the night, his consciousness cycling through the meditation patterns that allowed Kethraki warriors to remain alert during extended watches while still processing the extraordinary events he had witnessed. Princess Charlotte woke naturally as the first sunlight touched her face, sitting up in bed with the immediate alertness that children display when something important awaits them. Her first action was to reach for the transformed artifact on her nightstand, and Zakthal watched with continued amazement as the crystal responded to her touch with gentle pulses of starlight. "Good morning, Commander Zakthal," she said, her voice carrying none of the emotional exhaustion that had marked the previous evening. If anything, she seemed more centered than usual, as if the profound experience of the night had somehow strengthened rather than drained her. "Did you sleep well?" "Kethraki do not sleep as humans do, Princess," Zakthal replied, rising from his meditative position. "But I spent the night in peaceful contemplation. How do you feel this morning?" Charlotte held the crystal up to the morning light, watching the starfield within its depths sparkle and dance. "Different," she said thoughtfully. "Like I understand something important that I didn't understand yesterday. The voices are quiet now, but I can still feel them sometimes, not sad anymore, just grateful." A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted their conversation. Queen Isabella's voice carried clearly through the crystal and would, "Charlotte, darling, may I come in? We have some important matters to discuss this morning." "Of course, Mother," Charlotte called back, quickly placing the artifact back on her nightstand and straightening her nightgown with the automatic precision of someone trained in royal protocols from birth. Queen Isabella entered the chamber with the controlled grace that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the galactic hegemony. Her expression carried the subtle tension that Zakthal had learned to associate with complex diplomatic situations requiring careful navigation. Behind her followed Dr. Yuan Sato, the palace's chief xenopsychologist, whose presence immediately put Zakthal on high alert. "Charlotte," Queen Isabella said gently, settling onto the edge of the bed beside her daughter, "Commander Zakthal has reported some very interesting events from yesterday evening. Dr. Sato would like to ask you some questions about your experience with the gift from the Void Stalkers. Would that be all right?" Charlotte glanced at Zakthal, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "I suppose so," she said cautiously. "But I don't want anyone to take the crystal away. It's not dangerous anymore, and the people inside it need to know that someone remembers them." Dr. Sato activated a recording device that would capture not just audio but also the complex electromagnetic signatures that often accompanied psychic phenomena. "Princess Charlotte, can you describe what happened when you first touched the obsidian shard that Ambassador Krexith gave you?" Charlotte's explanation was remarkably coherent for someone her age, covering the initial contact with the trapped consciousness fragments, her intuitive understanding of their suffering, and the gradual process through which she had helped them find peace. Dr. Sato's expression grew increasingly amazed as the account continued, occasionally glancing at her instruments as they registered energy patterns that seemed to validate Charlotte's description of events. "And you experienced no discomfort or disorientation during this process?" Dr. Sato asked. "Exposure to concentrated psychic trauma usually requires extensive therapeutic intervention to prevent permanent psychological damage." Charlotte shook her head. "It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it didn't hurt. It was more like carrying something heavy that belonged to someone else. You do it because they need help, not because it feels good." Queen Isabella exchanged glances with Dr. Sato, and Zakthal recognized the silent communication that passed between them. They were witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, empathy, and the nature of psychic phenomena. The implications extended far beyond simple scientific curiosity, if humans could safely interact with forms of concentrated trauma that would destroy most other species, it suggested applications for conflict resolution and healing that could revolutionize galactic civilization.
Princess, Dr. Sato said carefully, would you be willing to participate in some controlled studies? Nothing dangerous or uncomfortable, but observations that might help us understand how you accomplished something so extraordinary? Charlotte looked thoughtful. Would it help other people? I mean, if there are more artifacts like this one, or other beings who are trapped and suffering?
It could potentially help a great many beings across the galaxy, Queen Isabella said.
But only if you feel comfortable with the idea. We would never ask you to do anything that made you unhappy or afraid. Charlotte nodded solemnly. Then, yes, I'll help. But Commander Zakthal has to be there.
He understood what was happening when no one else did, and I trust him. Zakthal felt something warm and fierce surge through his chest cavity, an emotion that his species had no precise word for but which humans would have recognized as protective love. The fact that this remarkable child trusted him enough to want his presence during what might be the most important research of their generation was simultaneously humbling and terrifying.
Of course, darling, Queen Isabella said. Commander Zakthal will be involved in every aspect of the research. Now, we need to discuss something else. Word of yesterday's events has already reached the Hegemony Council. They're requesting a formal presentation about what you accomplished. Charlotte's eyes widened. The whole council? All the species representatives? Yes.
What you did yesterday, transforming a Void Stalker artifact through empathic contact, it represents a breakthrough that could change how we approach interspecies relations across the galaxy. But that also means that a lot of very important people are going to want to understand exactly how you did it. Zakthal watched Charlotte process this information, seeing the moment when she fully grasped the magnitude of attention her actions would attract. For a 7-year-old, she displayed remarkable composure, but he could detect the slight tremor in her voice when she responded.
Will I have to do it again? Transform other artifacts in front of everyone? We don't know yet, Queen Isabella replied honestly. The Council's Xenopsychology Committee is developing protocols for safely studying your abilities. But, Charlotte, I need you to understand something important. You never have to do anything that makes you uncomfortable or afraid. Your well-being is more important than any scientific discovery or diplomatic advantage. Dr. Sato cleared her throat. If I may, Your Majesty, there's another consideration.
Princess Charlotte's abilities appear to be unprecedented, but we don't yet understand their limits or potential consequences.
Extensive exposure to psychic trauma could have cumulative effects that won't manifest for years or decades. Zakthal felt his protective instincts surge to maximum alertness.
Dr. Sato, are you suggesting that the princess's actions last night may have caused her harm?
I'm saying we don't know, Dr. Sato replied carefully. Human empathic capabilities are still poorly understood, even by human scientists.
What Princess Charlotte accomplished is so far outside normal parameters that we have no existing framework for assessing potential risks. Charlotte listened to this exchange with the serious attention of someone much older than her years. Finally, she spoke up, Dr. Sato, when you help people who are hurt or sick, do you worry that caring about them might hurt you? The question seemed to catch the xenopsychologist off guard.
Well, no, but that's different. Medical care involves established procedures and protective protocols. But you still have to care about your patients to help them properly, right? You have to feel sorry that they're suffering and want to make them better?
Yes, that's true.
Charlotte nodded as if this confirmed something important. Then, what I did isn't really that different.
I just cared about people who were suffering, and I wanted to help them feel better. The only unusual part was that they had been dead for a long time and their sadness got trapped in a rock. Zakthal found himself struggling not to emit the subsonic rumble that Kethraki produced when experiencing intense amusement. Charlotte's matter-of-fact analysis reduced a potentially paradigm-shifting scientific phenomenon to its essential emotional components, and, in doing so, revealed the profound simplicity that lay beneath its complexity.
Queen Isabella smiled at her daughter's explanation.
You make it sound very straightforward, darling.
Because it is straightforward, Charlotte replied. Adults just like to make things complicated so they can study them. But, caring about people isn't complicated, it's just caring.
Dr. Sato made several notes on her recording device, then looked up with an expression that mixed scientific fascination with genuine bewilderment. Princess Charlotte, you've just described empathy in terms that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness studies.
But, I need to ask, do you think other humans could learn to do what you did?
Charlotte considered the question seriously.
I don't know. Maybe?
But, I think they'd have to really want to help, not just be curious or want to prove something.
The voices could tell the difference, I think.
They only trusted me because they knew I actually cared about their pain. The implications of this statement sent ripples of excitement through the room. If Charlotte's abilities could be taught or replicated, if other humans could learn to safely interact with traumatized consciousness fragments, the applications for healing collective trauma across the galaxy would be limitless. But, Zakthal found himself focusing on a different aspect of Charlotte's response.
She had emphasized intention and genuine emotional investment as prerequisites for her abilities.
This suggested that empathy, at least at this level, could not be weaponized or exploited for purely strategic purposes. It required authentic caring, which made it both more valuable and more trustworthy than traditional forms of power. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority communication from the palace's central command center. Queen Isabella activated the holographic display, revealing the image of Admiral Chen Wei, the human representative to the Hegemony Council's Security Committee.
Your Majesty, Admiral Chen said without preamble, we've received an urgent request from the Void Stalker delegation. Ambassador Krexith is requesting immediate audience with Princess Charlotte.
They claim the transformed artifact has triggered some kind of species-wide consciousness event among their people.
Queen Isabella's expression shifted to full diplomatic alert. What kind of consciousness event, Admiral?
We're not entirely certain, but preliminary reports suggest that void stalkers across the galaxy are experiencing emotions they've never had before. Empathy, grief, what they're calling caring pain for beings they've previously consumed.
Their entire social structure appears to be undergoing rapid transformation. Zakthal felt his battle instincts activate as he processed the potential implications.
If the Void Stalkers were experiencing massive psychological upheaval, they could become either valuable allies or extremely dangerous enemies, depending on how they processed their new emotional experiences. Charlotte, however, seemed unsurprised by this development.
They're remembering, she said quietly.
When I helped the voices in the Crystal find peace, it created a connection between the Void Stalkers and all the people they've hurt. Now they can feel what their victims felt, and they're learning that consuming suffering causes real pain to real beings. Dr. Sato's instruments registered significant electromagnetic activity as Charlotte spoke, as if her words were somehow resonating across dimensional boundaries.
Princess, are you saying that transforming the artifact created a permanent psychic link between the Void Stalkers and their historical victims?
Not exactly, Charlotte said, her voice taking on the thoughtful tone she used when trying to explain complex intuitions in simple terms. It's more like I showed them a mirror that reflects feelings instead of appearances. Now they can see themselves the way their victims saw them, and they don't like what they see.
Admiral Chan's image leaned forward with obvious urgency.
Your Majesty, the Void Stalker fleet that was en route to the Outer Rim territories has completely changed course.
They're now offering assistance to refugee populations they were previously planning to harvest. The strategic implications are enormous.
Queen Isabella turned to Charlotte with an expression that mixed maternal pride with diplomatic calculation. Darling, it appears that your actions yesterday may have accidentally prevented a war and initiated the largest species-wide psychological transformation in recorded history.
Charlotte blinked in surprise. I did all that just by being nice to sad people?
Sometimes, Zakthal said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of military experience, the simplest actions have the most profound consequences.
You didn't set out to transform an entire civilization, Princess. You just chose to care about suffering you could have ignored.
The transformed artifact on Charlotte's nightstand pulsed with brighter light, as if responding to the recognition of its broader impact. Zackthal watched the play of starlight across the crystal's surface and realized that he was witnessing something that would be studied and celebrated for generations to come, not as a military victory or technological breakthrough, but as proof that consciousness could evolve, that empathy could transform even the most hardened beings, and that a child's compassion could rewrite the fundamental equations of galactic politics. Admiral, Queen Isabella said, making a decision that would reshape the course of history, arrange for Ambassador Krexith to meet with Princess Charlotte this afternoon.
Full diplomatic protocols, but in an informal setting where genuine conversation can occur.
If the Void Stalkers are experiencing a species-wide awakening to empathy, we need to help them navigate this transition constructively. As the various adults began coordinating the logistics of this unprecedented diplomatic encounter, Zackthal found himself reflecting on how dramatically his understanding of duty had evolved since accepting this assignment. He had expected to serve as a living weapon, protecting a valuable political asset from physical threats. Instead, he had become witness to humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy, their ability to see suffering and respond not with strategic calculation, but with genuine care. Charlotte had shown him that consciousness was not a zero-sum game where one being's healing required another's defeat. Instead, she had demonstrated that empathy could create expansion rather than scarcity, that helping others find peace could actually generate more peace for everyone involved. The morning sunlight streaming through the chamber's windows caught the transformed artifact and cast rainbow patterns across the walls, turning the room into a gallery of dancing lights that seemed to celebrate the triumph of hope over despair, connection over isolation, love over fear.
Commander Zackthal, Charlotte said, interrupting his philosophical reverie, when Ambassador Krexith comes this afternoon, will you help me again?
I think they're going to be very confused about these new feelings they're having.
It would be my honor, Princess, Zackthal replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being.
As the planning continued around them, Charlotte reached out and took his armored hand in her small, warm fingers, the same gesture that had marked the beginning of their friendship 3 years ago, but now carrying the weight of everything they had experienced together. The touch that had once surprised him with its casual affection now felt like an anchor to something essential about the nature of existence itself. In that moment, Zackthal finally understood why he had never been able to maintain proper professional distance from this remarkable child. She represented something that transcended species, biology, and evolution, the possibility that the universe was fundamentally oriented toward healing, that consciousness naturally sought connection, and that love was not a weakness to be overcome but a strength to be cultivated. The Void Stalkers would come seeking understanding of their newfound capacity for empathy. The Hegemony Council would debate the implications for galactic security and diplomatic relations.
Scientists would study the mechanisms underlying Charlotte's abilities for decades to come.
But, for Zackthal, the most important truth had already been revealed in the quiet darkness of a child's bedroom, where voices across time had finally found peace, where suffering had been transformed into healing, and where a 7-year-old human had reached out her hand and changed the galaxy simply by caring enough to listen. The transformed artifact continued to pulse with gentle starlight, its rhythm now synchronized with Charlotte's heartbeat, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most profound victories were won not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple courage to feel another being's pain and respond with love.